Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. The chair recognizes himself for a 5-minute opening statement. Thank you to our witnesses who are before us today to testify on National Public Radio, NPR. I do have to note for the record that we invited NPR CEO Catherine Marr, who declined to appear today, to discuss NPR's alleged past efforts to pressure conservative and moderate voices into silence. Hopefully we can work out a time for her to appear to testify before this committee in the near future. The only reason not to appear in front of this committee at some point in the near future is if the allegations are both true and NPR doesn't care. Last month, longtime NPR business editor Yuri Berliner wrote an article published by conservative news website The Free Press accusing his then employer of having a, quote, absence of viewpoint diversity, end quote. Berliner criticized NPR for not reflecting the viewpoints of all Americans. Instead, Berliner wrote, NPR is, quote, the distilled worldview of a very small segment of the U.S. population, end quote, meaning the people clustered around the coastal cities and college towns. It was alleged that in recent years, NPR's extremely progressive viewpoints are evident in its coverage of major news stories. For example, just a couple of days ago, in an article on a recent bill regarding TikTok and foreign-owned social media, the author claimed that Congress had no, quote, direct evidence, end quote, that TikTok was a threat. That's simply not true. If NPR had listened openly and fairly to comments TikTok's own CEO made before this committee last year, they would know there was no real firewall between the Chinese Communist Party and the American company. They also failed to mention, which would have made it fair, they failed to mention the 3-hour security briefing that this committee had before the committee took up the bill. That type of biased viewpoint affects the way I and many others look at NPR's coverage of ongoing anti-Semitic riots at universities across the country. NPR's coverage of these chaotic protests has been borderline encouraging, nostalgic even, evoking the good old days of protesting the Vietnam War. NPR reporters have dismissed evidence suggesting external groups may have had a role in coordinating these protests, despite contrary reporting by outlets like the Wall Street Journal. As far back as 2005, NPR editors were aware of and trying to address a question that was bothering listeners. How truly national is NPR? For those in rural communities and in smaller towns like the folks I represent, nationally produced NPR news programs are not relevant and not of interest. Nationally produced NPR news programs often simply do not broadcast content that reflects, it doesn't have to be complete, but reflects some of their values and their culture. As a result of adopting a mostly progressive framing in so much of its reporting, NPR is losing audience share. At its peak in 2017, NPR had over 30 million weekly listeners. By 2022, NPR had lost 6.6 million weekly listeners. As a result, NPR has had substantial budget deficits and had to lay off up to 10% of its staff. What was intended to be a media organization that brought together millions of Americans across geographic, socioeconomic, and ideological boundaries to discuss the issues, to discuss life, the arts, and culture, has now turned into what appears to be a progressive propaganda purveyor, using our taxpayer dollars, no less. Now, to be clear, the local public radio station affiliates are not what I'm talking about. I would make the distinction that they have often been more responsive programming and local public interest in civic stories. I've generally thought the local radio stations in my part of Virginia mostly provide a public service and in many cases are useful in helping to preserve local heritage. NPR claims federal spending accounts for less than 1% of its annual operating budget. Although NPR receives only 1% in direct federal grants, local radio stations may use any portion of their federal grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to pay for NPR's membership dues and programming fees. And that figure is roughly 30% of NPR's revenue. This hearing is a chance for us to take stock of whether we should be using federal taxpayer dollars to promote one ideology to the exclusion of others. If NPR wants to create a one-sided ideological content that marginalizes a substantial proportion of Americans, they can fight it out with other media companies for market share and pay for it on their own dime, not the taxpayers. I would prefer NPR to return to its original mission under the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 to provide objectivity and balance in coverage of controversial subjects. To me, that means representing many different opinions in its news gathering. I want to thank our witnesses again and look forward to hearing your testimony.